tried to get on the internet here tonight. Can't reach the internet. We have no internet connectivity. Why? I've never seen it before. It says too many devices or something like that. And Craig's getting it on his computer. I'm getting it on the two computers I've got up here. So we've got a problem linking to the internet from down here that, as I say, I've never seen before. Thank you very much. So now we don't have the internet, so there's people from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. Maybe our Texas member is on, or trying to get on, and we can't even communicate to them to tell them that you can't see because we can't get on the internet. I have to get on the internet to tell them. Duh. That's not gonna work. So they're out there. I'm surprised they haven't started phoning me. I'll be sitting out in the lobby answering the phone, I think, for the rest of the evening. Anyway, we'll tell them tomorrow what happened, and or later tonight. We will be recording tonight's meeting, thanks to Craig and his telephone, which is sitting right in front of us here. We will record the slideshow and the audio. So we will have this program via Craig's Magic on the internet in a couple of days. And an email will go out to all of you telling you when it's there and where the link is if you fall asleep during the program or something like that. So what else went wrong? Oh yeah, yes, right. So behind me you'll see a very active screen. It has a mind of its own. We think that it will stay down if the projector is on. But we can't turn the projector on because that needs the HDMI outlet on my computer, but my HDMI outlet needs to feed the projector that's in front of me so you guys can see something. Otherwise, we'd all go home. So once in a while, the screen will have a mind of its own, will rise, and you will not see the slides. Don't panic. It will be coming down as soon as Craig can get it coming back down again. It's there still, amazing. You'll hear it, it'll warn you, it'll go beep, 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 and a few seconds later it will be on its way up and Craig will be pushing buttons over there to try to get it to come back down quickly. So that's the technology that goes on behind here. That's why I earn the big bucks to do this job. And I sweat the bullets from about 6:15 on every Wednesday night, once a month. Okay, so with that apology, over to you, President Peter.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. And to those of you who are watching this in sometime in the future, our apologies for. It's been a very exciting last hour here. Paul does very well. So to remind you then, we cannot send out on the internet, but we will have this posted, and you'll be able to, those of you at home are watching it later. A couple of announcements I would have made otherwise. Members from last year should have received their copies of Historic Kingston by now. It's been a difficult year because between snow and ice and illness, I think we've now got them all out. If you haven't received your copy, and you remember last year, please let us know. We have a winner for the Thousand Island book that Susie Smith left us. You'll remember that we put a golden ticket in one of the Historic Kingstons, and that was won by Diane Fielding. So she is now happily reading her book and dreaming of where she can go in the summer. And the last comment, because I'm being stared at by Peter Ginn, is to remind those of you who have not quite got around to sending in your membership for 2026. Please do so. The next reminder for you will be that your April limelight will not appear. So when it comes to April the 1st, April the 2nd, April the 3rd, and you're thinking, what's happened to the newsletter? It's not coming until we get your money. So with that, Duncan?
Thank you, Peter. My name's Duncan McDowell. I run the program here, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight. I'd especially like to welcome our speaker, Jake Breadman. I find it exciting to have a young scholar like Jake here, because in the last 2 or 3 decades, the writing of history, not just in Canada, but around the world, has branched out from the old orthodoxies of what we, I guess, had in high school, political history, economic history, a bit of social history, into new spheres of investigation, and Jake represents two of them. One is environmental history, which of course reflects our growing concern with the environment in the world, and the other is what's called public history. Now, environmental history is the study of how man reacts with nature and how nature determines what man does. Something that seems familiar, but something that historians haven't really paid much attention. They've taken it as a given. Well, Jake is doing a doctoral thesis. He's a senior doctoral student at Queen's on the impact of the climate and disease on the War of 1812. So think about it. It's not just gunpowder and marching, it is how man was governed by the environment in that conflict. Now, the second thing Jake has been very interested in is what's called public history, which may seem a rather obvious statement, but public history is carrying academic or credible research into the public sphere, where the viewer can view it in a museum, in a documentary film, in an artifacts display, in a way that is groomed to be credible and intriguing. So Jake has had a lot of employment in this field, and think of Parks Canada, think of the museums you visited in Ottawa. Jake has worked at places such as the Brock Monument, the old Fort Erie, and more recently here at Bellevue House with Parks Canada, which we'll be hearing about tonight. So as you get the impression, Jake is a pretty active young doctoral student. As a former doctoral supervisor, he's the sort of student you dream about. You see them every 3 weeks and their progress is commendable. That's attested to by the fact that Jake has already published a great deal, which is a great step forward for a would-be academic. Published in Ontario History, the Canadian Journal of Native Studies, and he told me he's just finishing an article on how video and board games impact on our understanding of history. So without further ado, I'll ask Jake to join us and tell us something about his work at Bellevue House.
So, hi everyone. Thank you, Duncan, for that wonderful introduction. As mentioned, I'm one of the guides at Bellevue House in Kingston, the home of Sir John A. Macdonald and his family from 1848 to 1849. And our interpretation at Bellevue primarily focuses on John A. Macdonald and his family life, also his political significance and legacy. But it's worth noting that his time at Bellevue was quite short, 13 months. So this presentation is inspired by one of my favorite questions that I get from visitors, which is, who else lived at Bellevue House? And though Macdonald is undoubtedly the most famous resident and perhaps the most historically significant, I hope to emphasize that these quote-unquote other residents also shaped and reflect Kingston's history, but also Canadian history more broadly. The many residents that lived at Bellevue House from 1841 to 1964 thus allow us to tell a microcosmic history of Kingston, British North America, and Canada. And one thing you'll also find is that there's like a surprising amount of connections and parallels between John A. Macdonald and some of the other residents of Bellevue House, which we'll sort of unpack further. So here we have Bellevue House. You've all been to Bellevue House, probably? Yeah? Has anyone been very recently?
No.
No? You guys will have to, so again, if you come by Bellevue House, let me know, shoot me an email, and I'll make sure to give you a personal tour of the home, and we can sort of unpack Macdonald together. Now, first though, I want to talk about Charles Hales, who was the gentleman that commissioned the construction of Bellevue House from around 1841 to 1843. At least those dates are according to an architectural historian named Jennifer McKendry, who you're all probably somewhat familiar with. Margaret Angus, another big name in Kingston history, posits a sort of slightly earlier date of construction, but we won't get into the nitty-gritty of all these little details with the construction period. But with Kingston being named the capital of the newly found province of Canada in 1841, Hales knew that the politicians and bureaucrats would be looking for a place to rent, which is primarily why he built Bellevue House between 1841 to 43. We're kind of uncertain as to who the architect that built Bellevue House was, but there are kind of two suggestions put forth by McKendry and Angus. One are these two gentlemen known as the Scobell brothers, who were fellow Methodists and friends of Charles Hales, and the other one is George Brown, a name that we're, again, all probably somewhat familiar with in Kingston. Brown was sort of responsible for a flurry of building in 1840s Kingston. Now, who exactly was Hales? Well, he was born in Northern Ireland in 1806, and he immigrated to Upper Canada in 1820, which, interestingly enough, is actually the same year that John A. Macdonald and his family also immigrated to Upper Canada and Kingston. And both Macdonald and Hales, and really many of the other residents of Bellevue House, are sort of representative of British North America's immigration policy after the War of 1812, which understandably discouraged American immigration and encouraged British immigration just because Britons were perceived to be more loyal than those upstart Republicans. So in 1816, for example, 1,250 immigrants, mostly British, entered British North America, and that number jumped to 12,800 by 1820 and increased ever afterwards. And to give you an idea of how that affected Kingston's population basically triples from 1831 to 51, so pretty drastic. Now, with the help of the wealthy Torrances of Montreal, Hales had numerous business ventures around Kingston. And in this way, Hales is kind of similar to the Macdonald family, whose settlement in Kingston was assisted by their cousins, the McPhersons. Colonel Donald McPherson, John A. Macdonald's uncle, who was a veteran of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, settled down with his family in Kingston around 1807, and the first family home that the Macdonalds lived at in Kingston, which is nowadays 110 to 112 Rideau Street, was actually owned by Colonel McPherson. So Macdonald and his family lived there free of charge, if I had to guess. Now, during the rebellions from 1837 to 38, which is a whole other topic of discussion, but during the rebellions, Charles Hales served as an officer in the 1st Frontenac Militia, which is the same militia unit that John A. Macdonald served in as well. So it's very possible that Charles Hales was one of the commanding officers leading Macdonald and others. Anyone recognize this building? What is it? Yeah, what is this building? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the Smith and Robinson building, which Hales actually enlarged in 1841. Now, equally as interesting as Charles Hales is his wife Charlotte, who was born in England to a Wesleyan Methodist minister. Charlotte was a member of the Female Benevolent Society alongside another prominent Kingstonian, who you all might be familiar with. Her name was Harriet Dobbs Cartwright. And the Female Benevolent Society was established in 1820 and was meant to provide care and education to the less fortunate. Now, given Charlotte's background as the daughter of a Methodist minister, a denomination that was decidedly against slavery in the 19th century, it should come as a little surprise that in 1839, the Hales family actually harbored an enslaved woman named Harriet Powell in Kingston. And if you look on the slide here, we actually have a letter that was written by Charlotte Hales to an American abolitionist that had helped Harriet Powell escape to freedom in Kingston. Now, unfortunately, Charlotte, soon after rescuing Harriet Powell, met with numerous tragedies. So previously, her 5-month-old son passed away in 1837, and then in 1844, she lost another son, and she died a month later in October 1844. And these feelings of immense loss that Charlotte must have experienced were shared by many in the 19th century when infant mortality rates were quite high. And there's somewhat of a connection here between Charlotte Hales and the first wife of Sir John A. Macdonald, a woman named Isabella Clark, who, as we'll learn, ends up losing her first child at Bellevue House. Prior to building Bellevue House, Hales commissioned the construction of 5 cottages facing King Street, which, again, you might all be familiar with. They're called Hales cottages, and they look kind of architecturally similar to Bellevue House. The cottages were built around 1841, and the Hales family probably lived at Bellevue House between 1843 and 45. But as we know, economic misfortune followed personal misfortune as the capital moved from Kingston to Montreal in 1844, and the value of all this housing that had been built decreased really drastically, which meant that the Hales had to rent out Bellevue House. So now we gotta ask, who were some of these early tenants of Bellevue House? By the way, on the slide here, we have an image by, I'm trying to think of his name, I think it's Andrew Jackson Downing, who was an American American architecture, and Jennifer McHenry in her article about Bellevue House sort of posits that Bellevue House was specifically inspired by this image in Andrew Jackson Downing's work, which is kind of neat. It looks very similar to Bellevue House. See, so there's the drawing, and you see the central tower especially, and the wings jutting off from either side are very similar. And this is a picture of one of the Hales cottages that you can see facing King Street. So Charles Hales now is looking for people to rent Bellevue House, and the first tenant was a man named James Harvey, who is a British Army officer that rented the house from a very short period of time, from 1845 to 46. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much about Harvey, his family life, or why he was posted to Kingston, but I do know that he appears in military records around 1842, where he's listed as the Deputy Ordnance Storekeeper at Toronto. So he's like the guy that was in charge of ammunition and things like that. I suspect that he was probably sent to Kingston in 1845 owing to the Oregon boundary dispute that was happening at that time. And he must have been appointed the ordnance storekeeper at Kingston and would have been charged with arming the Martello Towers, for example, which you can see on the slide here. Okay, now this is my second favorite guy that lived at Bellevue House. His name's William Ermatinger. Has anyone read about William Ermatinger before?
Was he up in the Sioux?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm from the Sioux. I knew the name.
Yeah. So his father, Charles Oakes Ermatinger, was a fur trader up there, and he married a woman named Meninoe, who was the hereditary head chief of the Ojibwa Sioux. And yeah, William is the son of Charles Oakes Ermatinger and Meninoe. And I think the historic site up there is called Ermatinger Clerge.
Clerg. Yes.
Clerg, yeah. Yeah. So this is that Ermatinger from the Sioux area. Now, Ermatinger rented Bellevue House from 1846 to 48, and we know that he was at Bellevue House in 46 because there's the Kingston newspaper. I've kind of clipped it on the slide here, where it says, "Birth on the 28th of October at Bellevue Terrace, the lady of Colonel W. Ermatinger of a son." Now, almost simultaneously with John A. Macdonald, Ermatinger studied law from 1829 to 1834. And unlike Macdonald, though, law didn't really suit William Ermatinger very well, at least so much as military service did. So while Ermatinger's brothers, Charles and James, served respectively in Lower Canada and Upper Canada during the rebellions, William served with distinction in Spain during the Carlist Wars from 1835 to 39. Has anyone heard of the Carlist Wars before? No, I hadn't heard of them until doing research for this presentation. So The Carlist Wars were, coincide with the rebellions in Canada, but the Carlist Wars were primarily a succession crisis with conservative and liberal factions. And interestingly, Ermatinger actually sided with the liberal faction on the side of constitutional monarchy versus absolute monarchy. And one historian, Brian Stewart, sort of sees Ermatinger siding with the side of constitutional monarchy as a sort of divergence from Ermatinger's Tory principles that he had been raised with. But I sort of disagree with that. Him, to me, siding with constitutional monarchy is really just par for the course for someone that was British in the 19th century, because Britons really prided themselves on their own constitutional monarchy. What's clearer to me is that William stood for law and order, so it's little surprise that upon his return to British North America in 1841, he became inspector and superintendent of police in Montreal, and was tasked with doing a variety of things, such as quelling striking canal workers, election-related riots, and also political and sectarian violence, which there was a lot of in mid-19th century Montreal. In 1849, for example, when the controversial Rebellion Losses Bill was passed, an Anglophone street mob burned down Parliament in Montreal, and Ermatinger was basically the person that was tasked with quelling that violence. There's actually quite a few similarities between MacDonald and Ermatinger, and therefore it's little surprise to me that they eventually go on to work together during the Fenian Raids, another conflict that you're all probably somewhat familiar with. So MacDonald established something known as the Government Constabulary for Frontier Service, which was sort of like a secret spy network that was tasked with finding Irish radicals in Canada and sort of rooting them out. And Ermatinger was appointed by MacDonald to be the director of the spy network in Lower Canada, what is now Quebec. So Ermatinger and MacDonald were actually two men that were really close together, interestingly enough. And of course, here we have a picture of Ermatinger from the McCord Museum in Montreal. Now, I'm not exactly certain what brought Ermatinger to Bellevue House from 1846 to 48, but I do know that he was married to his wife in July 1845. So he might have been renting the house as sort of like a country estate for her. But also, since William had a position that was where he would expect, it would come with some sort of violent reprisal, right? He's the guy that's going to be targeted by conservatives and reformers alike as a police officer. So it's possible that he might have rented Bellevue House as a way to kind of keep his family and his new wife safe, and just to kind of keep them away from the violence of Montreal. Who's this guy? Has anyone seen this portrait of MacDonald before? Couple? Yeah, I mean, I actually love this picture here because it shows MacDonald as a younger man. He's not really the elder statesman we see on the dollar bills, right? This is MacDonald as he would have looked like when he was living at Bellevue House from 1848 to 49. So MacDonald rents Bellevue House from 1848 to 49, as I mentioned. The time that he's renting Bellevue House, he's a well-established lawyer in Kingston that is sort of just starting his political career. In August 1847, so shortly before moving into Bellevue, his wife Isabella gave birth to their first son, and a few months later, MacDonald was running for re-election to represent Kingston in the Legislative Assembly. He built his campaign for that election around something known as the University Endowment Bill, which isn't too important, but if you want to talk about that later, feel free to ask and I can tell you a little bit about it. So in August 1848, the MacDonald family moved into Bellevue House. They moved there with the expectation that its location kind of away from the downtown core of the city would hopefully help Isabella's ailing health. But their time at Bellevue is pretty tragic, to be quite honest. So a month after they move into Bellevue House, their son, little John A., passes away. He's only about 13 months old. And then after that, from January to April 1849, MacDonald is back in Montreal tending to his parliamentary duties while poor Isabella is in this big home by herself with her servants. In June 1849, so this is, again, MacDonald's still at Bellevue House at this time, he formed something known as the British America League, which stood for a lot of things that later become part of MacDonald's national policy. So this British America League, for example, stood for the protection of Canadian manufacturing. It denounced an elected legislative council, the Rebellion Losses Bill, annexation, and emphasized loyalty to Britain and the Crown. In September 1849, which is the month that MacDonald moves out of Bellevue House, MacDonald's law partnership dissolves because his friend and law partner, Alexander Campbell, was kind of taking on the duties of the law office while MacDonald was tending to his political career. So they decided to kind of dissolve their partnership, and MacDonald ends up opening up a new practice. But all in all, MacDonald's time at Bellevue was colored by tragedy, but it was also a very politically significant time in his life, which is why I feel lucky that I get to talk about it all the time at Bellevue House. By the way, this portrait was probably done, unfortunately we don't have exact provenance on it. I even looked into it at Library and Archives Canada, but this portrait of MacDonald was probably done in the early 1840s when he had went back home to Scotland to visit some of his extended family. So here's a really interesting image. This is also at Library and Archives Canada. This is a locket depicting Hugh John MacDonald, John A. MacDonald's second son. And the reason why I wanted to include this picture is because it kind of gives us somewhat of an impression of what their first son, John Jr., would have actually looked like. So I love this piece. It's again depicting Hugh John MacDonald, and then here we have Isabella, MacDonald's first wife. Again, from the same period. Both the lockets are from around 1850, 1851. So would have been taken kind of shortly after they had moved out of Bellevue House. Now here's an interesting little map here, also from Library and Archives Canada. And the reason why I have this up here is because I want to show you where Bellevue House is, in case you don't know. So you can see C. Hales listed as the man that owns Bellevue House. There's Bellevue right there. That's the coach house where they would have had the carriages and horses and things like that. And here are the Hales cottages that I showed you on one of the earlier slides. Now, I think something that's really interesting that I want to show you is, I think it's kind of cut off, but down here is where a building would have been known as Alwington House. Has anyone heard of Alwington House before? Yeah, what is Alwington House? It was basically the building where the lieutenant governor sort of based his operations out of. Unfortunately, the building doesn't actually stand today, but I think there is a street kind of around where it is today, named Alwington. And the reason why I sort of bring that up is to tell you that Bellevue House was in an extremely fashionable neighborhood. I mean, it's literally a hop, skip, and a jump from where the lieutenant governor would have been staying. It's probably mentioned in Margaret Angus's book, The Old Stones of Kingston, although that was published in 1967, so Alwington might have been burnt down by then, unfortunately. But again, I wanted to show you this to show you that Bellevue is an extremely fashionable neighborhood, but it's also not a super well-developed area at the time. It's kind of like a country estate. So William Henry Powell Wolfe, really long name, he rented Bellevue House from 1851 to 52. His father was a guy named George Wolfe of the Royal Artillery, and his mother, Mary Chandler, was the daughter of Kenelm Chandler, who was the barrack master and ordnance storekeeper at Quebec. Henry was born to George and Mary around January 1795, and he went on to attend the prestigious Royal Military Academy at Woolwich and then joined the Royal Engineers. Wolfe was a product of what I call the Quebec military aristocracy, which is further affirmed by his marriage to a woman named Mary Freer in 1829. Mary was the eldest daughter of a gentleman named Noah Freer, who was perhaps one of the most important military bureaucrats in the War of 1812. You know, as someone that is reading a lot about the War of 1812, Noah Freer is very important. He was sort of like the personal secretary for Sir George Prevost. Now, since William was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in 1851, and the fact that he rents Bellevue from 51 to 52, I speculate that Wolfe was probably sent to Kingston on assignment and would have been tasked with strengthening fortifications around the city and along the Rideau Canal. Around this time, you also had the Bytown and Prescott Railway, which was constructed specifically from 1852 to 54. And Wolfe might have been the engineer with preliminary oversight for this project. So Wolfe, out of all the figures that I've researched for this presentation, definitely requires a lot more research, which I am looking into, because I do want to find out more about him. And this is one drawing from Wolfe that I was able to find at Library and Archives Canada. It's a view of what he calls the Quebec Esplanade from the Royal Engineers office. And I like it. It's a kind of cute little winter scene. And then there's another drawing by Wolfe of the Chateau Saint-Louis. Now, like Charles Hales, William Ferguson, the resident that rents and then buys Bellevue House after Wolfe, Ferguson was a Protestant born in Northern Ireland around 1809. He immigrated to Upper Canada in 1826 and settled in Pittsburgh Township, just across the LaSalle Causeway, or as it was called back in the 19th century, the Penny Bridge. William and his father were at least two people that provided forage and fuel for the garrison in the surrounding area. And they also would have provided stone for the construction of Fort Henry from 1834 to 36. Mary Jane Walker, who was Ferguson's wife, was born in Ireland around 1817, and she married William in 1833. By 1861, when the family is living at Bellevue House, they had 13 children. I know. So this is kind of a funny thing. From what I've been able to find, they had one servant, probably because they had their children to kind of do their bidding for them most of the time. So they had 13 kids, but only one of those children, Charles Marks Ferguson, goes on to have any children himself. So the other 12 must have been put off from having children, growing up with, 12 other siblings, it seems. And initially, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the Ferguson family rented Bellevue from 1852 to 55 before eventually purchasing it from the Torrances in 1855. A Kingston directory from 1857 states, quote, that W. Ferguson, Esquire, occupies a very handsome villa in this part of the city on the Lakeshore Road, which is finely covered and surrounded by shrubbery, gardens, etc. And the Ferguson family lived at Bellevue until 1869. And one of the frequently asked questions we get at Bellevue House, this is like the most common question I get, and I love it because I got to do some research. So we're often asked, how much did Bellevue House cost? And thankfully, through William Ferguson, we know that Ferguson purchased it from the Torrances for £1,500. Now, what does that mean? It's hard to do sort of currency conversions, especially to modern day currency, but I used the currency converter at the National Archives in the UK, through which I was able to determine that £1,500 in 1850 could get you 100 horses, 280 cows, and worked out to the wage of a skilled tradesman over the course of a 20-year period. So it was a lot of money. I don't dare try to translate that to modern Canadian currency. I have down here $200,020. I'm screwing up the number, but anyways, $200,000, which I really don't think is correct, honestly. Yeah.
Did they use British pounds in Canada, Upper Canada at the time?
That's a good question. They kind of used a mix of currency a lot of the time. So sometimes they use something called Halifax currency. Sometimes they use British pounds. Sometimes they use American dollars. It seems that Ferguson himself, though, used British pounds. I'm not sure, though, maybe someone in the room might know when there becomes a sort of standard Canadian currency. That's a good question. But yeah, different types of currency floating around, especially in the early days of Upper Canada and even into the 1830s and 40s as well.
Perpendicular to the lake.
Mm.
Was that a phenomenon of the time?
That's interesting. I know, like in New France and in Quebec, they often had these sort of like long lots, kind of like what you're seeing here. And a lot of the times in the English or the British system, it was often like square lots. I don't know. I actually don't have a good answer to that.
It was water-based.
Yeah.
Yeah, transportation was water-based, so your frontage on the water was what counted.
Yeah.
I understand it.
Sorry, was there do you have a question?
No, I'm just thinking when then they went up again.
Yeah. You'll see once we get to the 1880s, this is all, they're all, like, a lot of what you see here is subdivided quite a lot more into much smaller plots. So this map that I have here is from 1865, and we see that Bellevue House, right there. It's referred to as Bellevue Terrace rather than Bellevue House. Kind of interesting. Who recognizes this view? What is this?
You from Fort Henry.
So this is a painting from the Baldwin collection of Canadiana at the Toronto Public Library. And it's by a German artist named Augustus Kollner, and it depicts Kingston in 1848, which is the time that MacDonald and his family lived at Bellevue House. But the reason why I'm including it alongside William Ferguson is because this area that we're seeing right here is where he and his father initially settled down in Kingston before they eventually go on to become locally prominent and are renting, across the water. Now, William Ferguson is probably one of the most civic-minded Kingstonians that lived at Bellevue House, though I think MacDonald would probably object to that. So Ferguson was county treasurer from 1846 to 1867, and he only relinquished the position to become the county sheriff in 1867. And Ferguson family lore, which I was reading about in Limelight, actually, states that William was a very dedicated supporter and friend of Sir John A. Macdonald. So much so where, according to the Ferguson family, when Macdonald would sort of disappear on a drinking binge, apparently Ferguson was usually the one that was able to track Macdonald down. Now, Ferguson and his family owned William Ferguson & Co., which imported dry goods, things like tobacco, tea, and coffee, to Kingston. And William's son, William B. Ferguson, was a bookkeeper for that company. It's worth noting as well, again, as I was looking through the Kingston directory, the Ferguson family also owned a highly valued schooner named the Arabian, which they would have used to transport goods all across Lake Ontario and up the Rideau Canal as well. He also had his hands in a lot of other projects in Kingston, so he's listed as one of the directors of the Kingston Gas Light Company, and also as the president of the Frontenac Agricultural Society, which is really important for us at Bellevue because we kind of speculate that Ferguson was the guy that really developed and amplified the grounds and garden at Bellevue House. Unfortunately, the 5 letters that we have that are written by MacDonald during his time at Bellevue doesn't really mention anything about the grounds or garden, unfortunately. Which isn't to say that there wasn't a grounds and garden when MacDonald was living there, but we do know for a fact that Ferguson was the guy that really developed the grounds in the 1860s. And yeah, this is another really neat map here. We have, again, Bellevue Terrace, and this is a military map from 1869, so it's a lot more detailed than some of the other maps that we've seen so far. And we see Bellevue Terrace here is surrounded by gardens and shrubbery. We also see there's a summer house, this is approximately kind of where our gazebo is on the property today. The summer house would have been where most of the cooking would have been done in the summer months, because in the summer when it's really warm outside, you don't want to make your house really, really hot by having someone cooking all day. And here we have a writ of return where William Ferguson, as the county sheriff and returning officer for Kingston, which is like the guy that counts up the votes, essentially, Ferguson, as the returning officer, declared Sir John A. Macdonald to have a majority of the votes in the Kingston election of 1867. So here's a direct connection between Macdonald and Ferguson. James Davis, a Kingston merchant, purchased Bellevue House from Ferguson in 1869 and then eventually sold it to Thomas Baker in 1870 for $3,400. And again, we see the currency has changed. Dollars is presumably American dollars for whatever reason. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much about Thomas Baker, which is kind of the curse of having a really common name, as some of you might know, and doing genealogical research on your own family. But I was able to find him in the 1871 Census of Canada, where he's listed as a widowed Irish Catholic born around 1860. His occupation is listed as gentleman. Oh, sorry, I have 1860, but I meant 1806. Yeah, Thomas Baker is born around 1806. His occupation is listed as gentleman, and his daughter is listed as Keedy on the census, and is said to have been born in Ontario around 1852. They also had a 14-year-old Irish girl living with them. You can see her name right there, named Alice McGarvey. Her occupation isn't listed, but I'm assuming she was probably a servant. And just to kind of give you some insight into the research process, the reason I know this is the correct Thomas Baker that was living at Bellevue House is because his nearest next door neighbor on the census form is Alexander Campbell, who we talked about earlier, right? That's MacDonald's friend and law partner. But Campbell actually lived immediately north of Bellevue House at a place called Hillcroft, which is a really nice house you can still see today. And there's a picture of it. So when doing research, I'm usually able to confirm whether or not someone's actually living at Bellevue House, because Campbell is usually directly below them on the census. Now, as opposed to someone like Thomas Baker, who has a common name, sometimes when you're doing research, you have a historical figure with a really exceptionally unique name, like Pennyman White Worsley, possibly the most English name I've ever heard. Worsley was born in England around 1838, and his father was an Anglican vicar. But now Worsley seemingly had an appetite for military service and is listed as a lieutenant in the 4th Battalion of the 60th Rifles around 1865 or so. And I know for a fact that Worsley fought during the Fenian raids. Does anyone know what the Fenian raids are? What are the Fenian raids? Yeah.
It's Irish in the States came over to raid in Canada a few times.
Yeah, exactly. So you had these disaffected Irish people that wanted to take parts of British North America and use it as a bargaining chip to regain Ireland's independence from Britain. And Pennyman White Worsley actually served at Fort Erie in 1866 and was probably at the Battle of Ridgeway, which I have depicted on the slide here. He was also serving in Quebec in 1870 and was watching for potential Fenian incursions at the time. I'm not sure the exact numbers. I do know that the Battle of Ridgeway was a battle where the Canadian militia kind of embarrassed themselves, unfortunately, but that's a story for another day. But it kind of makes sense. I mean, a lot of these Irishmen had been fighting in the American Civil War prior to the Fenian raids, so they had a lot of military experience versus the Canadian militia, many of whom, if they had seen any service, would have been 30 years prior during the rebellions. And then here's a photograph of the 60th Rifles, which is the regiment that Pennyman White Worsley belonged to. Here you have the ordinary soldiers and then some officers in the back here. Now, Worsley's wife was named Albina Elizabeth Sicot, and she was born at St. Hyacinthe in 1842 and was the daughter of a gentleman named Louis Victor Sicot, who was, interestingly enough, one of Johnny MacDonald's political opponents. And this image here isn't Albina, but it's actually Albina's sister. So it kind of gives us some sort of impression of what Albina might have looked like. Altogether, Pennyman and Albina, and their really unique names, had 6 children, 2 of whom were born at Bellevue House. And there are some really interesting parallels between Pennyman and Johnny MacDonald, not just the fact that, you know, Albina's father was one of MacDonald's political opponents, but Hugh John MacDonald, MacDonald's son, when he was 16 years old, served in the Fenian raids as well. So shared service between Pennyman and Hugh John. More than that, though, there's also some interesting religious connections. So Pennyman, for example, was Anglican. Makes sense. He was raised by an Anglican vicar. Albina, on the other hand, was Catholic, right? Now, we see that Albina, where is she? Okay, right here. So, his name is listed as Penham Y, which is incorrect, but again, it might have been because Pennyman was probably working at the Royal Military College or was sort of out of the house at the time, and it was Albina that was the one giving this information to the census taker. So that's why the name is probably incorrect. So here you have Penham listed as the head, and we see that all the male children that they have are listed as Anglicans, and the daughters are listed as Catholic. So we see they've come to some sort of compromise into how they're going to raise their children, in that the boys will be Anglican like the father, and the daughters will be Catholic like their mother. I mean, really, talk about a religiously diverse household, because they also had servants working with them, 2 of which were also Anglicans, and the other one was a Methodist. Does anyone know about Johnny MacDonald's relationship to Catholicism? Yeah.
He didn't like it. He didn't convert till after a family tragedy.
Yeah, that's right. So Johnny MacDonald's son, Hugh John MacDonald, actually, his first wife was a Catholic woman, and MacDonald was highly disapproving of the marriage, which partially sort of strained the relationship between Johnny MacDonald and Hugh John MacDonald. Okay, so here we have an 1878 map of Kingston, and there's a couple things worth noting here. First of all, take note of how much the area has developed since we first saw it in the 1850s, right? You have all these plots that have been subdivided. Here we have Bellevue House right here, still quite big. You know, they haven't sold off the whole property. By this time, Bellevue House was anywhere between 2.5 to 3 acres, so quite big. Now, Worsley sold Bellevue House to James Wilson in 1887, and James Wilson is the gentleman right here, that we actually have a photo of him, which is really, really cool. We actually have the negatives of this photograph in the archives at Bellevue House. So this is James Wilson here with his very angry looking dog. We know, according to the 1891 census of Canada, that Wilson was born in Ireland around 1831, and he's listed as the manager of the recently built Kingston dry dock. And thankfully, we have unpublished manuscript at Bellevue House from the Wilson family that actually kind of fills in some of the details that are missing from the census. So according to this family history, it says, James Wilson was appointed, quote, superintendent of waterworks in Kingston. He was a friend of Sir John A. Macdonald. He was an impatient man who, quote, had to be met at the front door with his dinner plate and was said to drink too much. He owned and lived in Bellevue House, where 3 proud beauties were reared, as well as a son, Bob. After his eldest daughter, Victoria Katie, married John Burkett, the 2 families lived together at Bellevue House. And the Kingston Dry Dock and Pump House is located where the Great Lakes Museum is today. It was built from 1890 to 92. And of course, Kingston, as you all know, had always been a major and important shipbuilding center on the Great Lakes. And the dry dock allowed for ships to be easily built and repaired. And the construction of the dry dock is related to John A. Macdonald's later career and a very specific scandal, which I won't go into too much detail about, but we can talk about that later. Macdonald had primarily won re-election in 1891 because of his support for the construction of the dry dock, which promised to bring a lot more jobs to the city. And with the announcement of funding for the dry dock, that was actually Macdonald's last public appearance. He laid the cornerstone of the building. So if you go into the Great Lakes Museum today, you can actually see the cornerstone that has John A. Macdonald's name on it, which is pretty interesting. Now, Macdonald's support for the construction of the dry dock was quite scandalous because it went to a man named Andrew C. Bancroft, who didn't actually exist. I know. Now, the details of this are really fascinating, but it's too much to get into for the presentation. But just as a quick summary, it involves insider trading, fake bidding, and funneling public money to political allies. It's actually been suggested that the stress from this political scandal hastened Macdonald's death in the 1890s. Now, the connection between Macdonald, the Wilson family, and Kingston Infrastructure Project goes even deeper. James Wilson and his wife Mariah had 2 daughters, one of them being named Victoria. And Victoria was married to John Burkett. And together they had 2 children named Edmund and Leonard. And in 1891, the Wilsons and the Burkett family were living at Bellevue House together. John Burkett, I'm not sure if you can see it on here. Oh yeah, there he is. John Burkett, you can see his occupation right here. He's listed as the secretary of Kingston's Locomotive Works. And by 1890, the Locomotive Works was on the verge of closure with competition from other railway companies in Canada. But Macdonald promised the Kingston Locomotive Works that if he won re-election in 1891, he would give them a government contract for the construction of 120 railway cars. So if you're wondering who John Burkett and James Wilson voted for in the federal election of 1891, it's probably Macdonald. Here's an awesome photo. For those of you that have been to Bellevue House, you'll recognize this is the front porch here, and this is from the Wilson Burkett family's photo collection that we have at Bellevue. This young guy here is probably Edmund or Leonard Burkett on his horse right in front of the front porch. It's a really neat little image, and look at how much shrubbery we have around. The grounds don't quite look like that today, but I hope maybe someday we can get there. Look at the hanging plants, more flowers there. And then here's another image of Bellevue House, also from the 1890s and from the Wilson Burkitt family's photo collection. You can see some people down here, and then there's another person up here. So John Gilbert purchased Bellevue House from the Wilson Burkitt family in 1907, and Gilbert was born in Ontario somewhere between 1850 to 1860, but his parents were both born in Ireland. So Gilbert, to me, is sort of representative of a lot of the Irish immigrants that came to Kingston and Upper Canada more generally in the 1840s and 1850s. And Gilbert's wife was a woman named Sarah Morrison, and together they had 3 children, William James Gilbert, Evelyn, and John Gilbert. And according to John Gilbert's death certificate, which I have on the slide here, John Gilbert had worked as a grocer in Kingston for 75 years. At the time of his death in 1948, he had last worked as a grocer in 1945. So he was probably still working up to the age of 90, which is pretty exceptional. Now, the eldest son of John and Sarah, William James, served in the First World War. He served 4 years in Kingston's Princess of Wales' own regiment before enlisting with the CEF at Kingston in 1915. His medical exam describes him as having dark hair and complexion, blue eyes, 5'8", and being 118 pounds. And he served as an engineer in the conflict, so he would have been responsible for a lot of manual labor. So it's not surprising to me when I was sort of reading through his service record, you get to the end and see his discharge certificate. He had gained about 40 pounds in the service. So he had put on a lot of muscle, if I had to guess. He was also promoted from sapper to lieutenant in 1917, so he seems to have been a very good soldier. And in his service record as well, here's a page from it, we can see his address is initially listed as quote-unquote Bellevue, Centre Street, Kingston, Ontario, but is eventually crossed out and is changed to 29 Carleton Street in Toronto. Because after the First World War, he came back home, stayed with his family at Bellevue for a little bit, studied at Queen's University, and then ended up moving to Toronto with his wife and opened up a dental practice there before eventually coming back to Kingston in later life. And if I remember correctly, he passed away in the 1950s. He's buried in the Cataraqui Cemetery. And then here's another census. This must be 1921. Okay, so here's William James Gilbert. You can see him. Address listed as King West. The page previous to this lists John Gilbert and his wife as well. Do we have anyone here that's related to the Atack family? A-T-A-C-K? Anyone? No? So, Bellevue House was empty from 1923 until 1927, but in 1927, Dr. Frederick William Atack moved into the house. He was born in Lincolnshire in 1892, married his first wife, Annie, in 1913, and they had one child together named Leonard Atack, who is pictured on the slide here. Leonard was the eldest of all the Atack children and attended KCVI and then the Royal Military College. And this image here is actually his yearbook photo from the Royal Military College. Leonard later moved to Ottawa and attained a pretty high rank in the Canadian military and eventually passed away in 1994. And a really, really interesting aside, I actually met one of Leonard's daughters last year at Bellevue House, which was really, really cool. She told me, because again, she was raised in Ottawa with the elder Atack's son here. She told me that in the summers, she would often come stay with her Atack cousins at Bellevue House, which was really, really neat. It was really cool to hear of her own experiences at Bellevue House before it was actually a National Historic Site. Now, Dr. Atac's second wife was Alice Harrington, and they had 4 boys together, Ned, Dan, Jim, and Jack. But sadly, Alice passed away in 1936, and Dr. Atac's third wife was named Mabel Borden Gardner. And together they had 2 children named Bob and Nancy. And again, last year was really cool because last year I met Bob, one of the children. And again, really interesting to hear him talk about the house and what his family used all the different rooms for. So you're going to have to you're going to have to excuse me for the quality of this photo here, but this image depicts Dr. Atac, who's at the center, one of the daughters of the Atac family, and then kind of to Dr. Atac's right here, you have Mabel Gardner, his third wife, and this is their dining room. Nowadays, the Atac family dining room is Isabella's bedroom. Now, across from Isabella's bedroom, we have the dining room for the MacDonald family, but what is now depicted as the MacDonald family's dining room was when the Atac family was living at the house. It was actually Dr. Atac's personal study, which is pretty neat. Now, Dr. Atac was a published chemist and president of DICO, a position that he held until 1961. During the Second World War, Dr. Atac was the chair of Kingston War Services Board, and DICO actually had secret contracts with the Canadian government during the war, and they were trying to basically produce a paint that could be used to detect mustard gas. And for his contributions, Dr. Atac was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1946. And we actually know a lot about the Atac family and their time. They're almost 30 years at Bellevue House through the Atac family and the history that they told to Parks Canada historians in the 1960s. So for one, here we have, again, sorry for the quality, this is from like an old 1960s history of Bellevue, but here's Bellevue in the background, and you can see all these children playing in front of it. Apparently Bellevue House, because it had such expansive grounds, was kind of like the local play place for all the kids in the neighborhood, which is kind of fun. Here's another picture of Bellevue House. Apparently, the Atac family used to sled down the hill that leads into what is now our garden. So, and apparently at Christmas time, Bellevue House was bedecked with Christmas lights, and apparently it was something to see in Kingston in the 1940s and 50s. Now, the last gentleman to live at Bellevue House was Dr. James Beveridge and his wife, Jean Frances Eaton, both pictured on the slide here. They lived at the house from 1959 to 1964, and Bellevue was sold to Parks Canada in 1964 for $32,500, which, again, if you convert it to today's modern day currency, would be like $325,000. But again, that's a rough estimate. Dr. Beveridge and Jean were a highly educated couple. They met at Acadia University, where Dr. Beveridge initially did his undergrad, but Dr. Beveridge eventually received a PhD from the University of Toronto and an MD from Western University before being appointed the Crane Professor of Biochemistry at Queen's University from 1950 to 1964, which covers the period that they lived at Bellevue. And in 1964, Dr. Beveridge became the president of Acadia University, a position that he held until 1978. And Dr. Beveridge was actually awarded the Order of Canada in 1977 for being a physician, biochemist, and educator who, quote, had given unstintingly of his talents in all these disciplines to the particular benefit of the maritime provinces. And we also have some information about Jean as well. We know that, for one, she was a big reader and a dedicated gardener. And for those of you that have been to Bellevue House, you know there's quite a big garden there. And based on some of the pictures that we had just seen, she would have had lots of different plants to tend to while she was living there with Dr. Beveridge. Now, after a period of restoration from 1964 to 67, Bellevue House was open to the public for the 100th anniversary of Confederation in 1967. So nowadays, it's interpreters like myself that care for Bellevue House. And in a way, we have sort of become part of the history, like all the other residents of Bellevue House that have lived at the home from 1841 all the way to 1964. So it really, to me, is a pleasure to be part of this history that spans back all the way to the early 1840s. Now, I hope through this talk you were able to learn something about Kingston's history, Canadian history, but also the MacDonald family and the many families that lived at Bellevue House for about 120 years. And it really, to me, is surprising how many parallels and connections each of these families have to MacDonald, whether those connections be direct or indirect. And I've totally gone over my time. I'm really sorry for that, but I do hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for letting me ramble on about this for so long, and thank you for listening.
I'm struck name in Kingston. The people evoke the notion of hordes of Irishmen arriving on the docks and being shunted into the hinterland. Again and again in your talk, we understand, admittedly probably mainly Protestant
Yes.
Irish coming here, but making their mark in Kingston, doing very well and living in a posh area of Kingston. Yeah, the only Catholic Irishman that I can really think about that lived at Bellevue was Thomas Baker, is the one. A lot of them were probably what we would now call Anglo-Irish, like Ulster settlers a lot of the time. So that might partially be why they were able to really establish themselves in such a posh area, if I had to guess. But Thomas Baker being one notable exception to that rule. Yeah, I'm glad to know about it because Kingston's often described as being dominated by an Anglican establishment group. Yeah. And it was, but it's nice to see the Irish playing a significant secondary role. Yeah. So. Which actually, speaking of religion and politics, I mentioned that earlier that MacDonald ran his campaign in 1847 on something known as the University Endowment Bill, which I think now would probably be the time to talk about it because it's really interesting. And it kind of shows you that MacDonald was more of a moderate conservative in the 1840s. So in Upper Canada, in the early and up to the mid-19th century, politics was largely dominated by a group of Anglican loyalists a lot of the time. But MacDonald himself was sort of outside of that Anglican political clique as someone that was raised a Scottish Presbyterian. So MacDonald running his campaign around this University Endowment Bill actually fits quite well with his own upbringing and personal politics. Basically, MacDonald said, and he believed as a conservative, that the Anglican Church still should have a special place in Upper Canadian society and politics, but he also believed that other religious institutions should be endowed with funds as well. And that was something that proved him to be a sort of more moderate figure, especially when a lot of the other conservatives were so gung-ho on just making sure that Anglicanism was the sort of dominant religion at the time. So MacDonald struck a sort of compromise between the hardline Tories and some of the reformers. Yeah, and by coincidence, in 1849, the University of Toronto was created as a result. It's a small university to the west of us. Another thing that struck me about what you had to say is many of these people who are inhabitants there were contributing what political scientists call the state formation, the police, the universities, political parties, the beginnings of the kind of structure of government we get after Confederation. Yeah. And it's not just MacDonald, it's these men who are educated and connected to these institutions that are in effect putting Canada in place, ready for Confederation. Yeah. The occupations, I mean, as you saw, they range from merchants, a lot of soldiers
as well. Police officers like Ermatinger, politicians. Yeah, it really, they sort of ran the gamut of occupations. It's very interesting, and I do hope, because I am planning to turn this into a publication for the Kingston Historical Society. That's gonna, I think it's published in Limelight, right?
Yes. No, it's published in Historic Kingston with Peter here.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I'm hoping to go into detail a bit more than kind of what I was able to do this evening on some of these people, their occupation, and their contributions to Kingston, but also Canada more generally.
Your research also underscores how popular things like Ancestry.com are now, and the meticulousness of your research.
Yeah.
Very much so.
On a purely practical question here, when Bellevue House was built, would it have had septic tanks or outhouses?
We do have a cistern. Now, it's not the actual historic cistern that would have been at the home, but it did have running water. But it was running water in the sense that it would just like run down from the roof into the basement. So, yeah. So it was really a finite resource, not like running water as we might think about today.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Were you able to find if any of the owners did any extensive renovations themselves throughout the year, or which ones did?
Yes, I was. Actually, just recently as well. I know that the Gilbert family, based on my own research, were actually the ones that put in electric lighting at Bellevue House. So that's one thing. I also know that it was the Worsleys in their time at Bellevue House where they did quite a lot of repairs on the interior of the home. So, yeah, to answer your question, it was largely the Worsleys and the Gilberts based on what I've been able to find.
Peter has a comment he'd like to make.
Well, after you thank him.
No.
Jake, I'm amazed how you survived tonight. With the screen going up and down, with every time it went up, we were sitting here saying, is it going to come down? That was a challenge, and I apologize to the audience and congratulate you, quite honestly, on surviving it all. Fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, to be honest, you guys are a much better audience than what I'm used to. I mean, a lot of the times at Queen's, you get like what is supposed to be a 200-person lecture and like 50 people show up, so.
Well, the lecture did have its ups and downs.
Yes.
I'm going to call on Kate MacDonald, to another doctoral student from Queen's, to thank our speaker tonight.
Jake and I have known each other for very many, many, many years, and I'm so grateful that you came and got to present on this research. I got to hear a little sneak peek of this research earlier in the summer, because Bellevue House hosts scholars of all kinds, researchers of all kinds, to come speak at Bellevue House, and the public is welcome to come kind of listen. Jake did it one, I did one, so watch out for this summer. They're doing it again. I'm sure, I don't know what you'll present on, but thank you so much. This is a token of our appreciation, and if we could, another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you again, Jake. Our next lecture will be on April the 15th, another Wednesday, when Thomas Harrison, a local lawyer, artist, and writer, will come to tell us about Vice President Richard Nixon's secret visit to Eastern Ontario in 1957. So, it's better than Jonathan Vance, but anyway. So that's April the 15th, and thank you again for coming.